I've had this milling vise for well over a year, and it's just been sitting on a shelf waiting for me to get around to taking it apart and giving it a good cleaning. I want to remove the swivel base. There's a couple of indexing pins and nuts that hold the vise to the swivel pin. Plus there's a center pivot piece that needs to come out. In the back of the movable jaw is this grub screw that I need to at least loosen up a little bit. That grub screw clamps the movable jaw to the sliding nut that's underneath it. And down inside this cavity underneath the jaw is this half sphere, which sits into a corresponding feature in the jaw itself. The jaw plates for both the movable jaw and the fixed jaw are just held on with these large socket head cap screws. To remove the fixed jaw, I need to turn the vise upside down. There are a couple of longer socket head cap screws that come in from the bottom that hold that piece of the fixed jaw in place. And with those screws removed, I can remove that fixed jaw off of the vise base. Now on this vise, there's a key that goes in the vise base and also the corresponding key slot in the fixed jaw. I know with some vices of this design, the key is integrated in the fixed jaw itself. Pretty safe bet that this bolt that's in the retaining collar is not factory. It needs to come out so I can unscrew the retaining collar that holds the vise screw in place. Using a vise handle on the end of the screw, I took a Allen key wrench and stuck it in the hole where that bolt was, and then just used the handle to spin the screw, and that unscrewed the retaining collar. And with that off, I can slide out the entire screw and nut. Interestingly enough, on this particular vise, there were no thrust bearings or anything on the screw. I don't know if they were ever on there and some previous owner removed them, or that because this is just a cheap import, that it never came with them. And on the opposite side of the nut is this plastic cap, presumably in there to keep chips from building up. And if I can remember that this is a left-handed tapped hole, it makes it easier to take that thing out. There's an ID plate on the side of this that is fairly worn down to nothing. There's some embossed numbers, which might be a serial number, could be a model number. None of the searches I tried brought anything up on the internet as to what this vise is, who made it, where it came from, or anything. I was not likely to reuse it, but I still wanted to try to get these drive screws out cleanly. Was very unsuccessful with that, so I just opted to break them off and leave what was in the vise and just paint over it. Some time ago, I quit recording how I clean parts like this. I always kind of felt like that there was some that it was boring and repetitive. But I figured my technique for doing this stuff has evolved over the last year or so. I figured I'd just share what I've been doing lately. I find that to get into some of these hard to reach or these tight spots, I borrow my wife's toothbrush, and then when I'm done with it, I wash it in gasoline and put it back on the sink. For parts like this that have a lot of machine services, I have this softer wire cup that I put on a pneumatic angle die grinder. And then I also have this softer wire wheel that I'll use for some of these other tight spots. As great as the pneumatic tools are at removing stuff quickly, I still prefer, for the most part, just Scotch-Brite and elbow grease. With everything clean of grease as best I can, I wipe everything down with some acetone in preparation for painting. For paint, especially for cast surfaces, I use a Rust-Oleum enamel straight out of the can. I never use any primer, or if I do, it's very rarely. I find that for the cast iron surfaces, it's completely unnecessary. The purpose of a primer is to give a bond between the surface that you're painting and the paint itself. And these cast surfaces have so many pits and grooves and dimples that the paint sticks to it just fine. There really is no need for a primer. Of course, I see the benefit of the primer for perhaps a smoother, maybe machined surface that's intended to be painted. You need to give that surface some kind of tooth for the finish coat to bind to. But for these cast iron surfaces, I just find it a waste of time. And I know there's varying opinions on this, so feel free to comment on this video and tell me why I'm wrong. You may also notice that I am not using any masking tape. For parts like this, again, it's a waste of time. I am generally careful. I will clean up where I might drop some paint on a machine surface, but quite frankly, this enamel paint, it takes a little while to dry, to fully cure. I have loads of time to take a razor blade and clean up any surfaces in which I may have gotten some paint on where I don't want any. Now, that's not to say that I never use masking tape. I will use it from time to time. For example, on surfaces in which the cleanup is more of a pain than putting the tape on. Or if it's for a way surface, like the V-ways on the lathe bed. I masked those off before I painted the bed. Now I'll generally let this enamel paint cure for at least 2 days, sometimes 3, before I start putting it back together. Depending on outside temperature, it can take a while for it to cure to the point where that it's hard. And it continues to cure for days after that. I have increasingly become a fan of this Rust-Oleum enamel paint. As it cures, it gets harder and harder and harder. And on the lathe, as many chips that have built up in that chip tray, when I sweep them out and brush them off, there are still no dings, no scratches, nothing in the bottom of that chip tray a year after I had it finished. Well, now that the paint has cured reasonably, I can start putting this back together. In assembly, for the most part, is the same as taking it apart, just in reverse. What I should have done before starting to put this back together is gone back and watched the footage from when I took it apart, because then I'd know that I just put this nut in backwards. I'll figure that out eventually, but not before I'd already put quite a bit of it together. Or not. Yep, it's right about here, you big dummy. You realized you put the nut in backwards. Yeah, the vise works a little bit better when the nut's in this way. I'm going to install this half sphere now, and I'm putting a little bit of grease on the back of it, and that's essentially to keep it in place when I flip the movable jaw over. I learned the purpose of the half sphere by watching a video that Mr. Pete had done a while back on the Kurt Anglock vices. Essentially, since there's no way to machine the surface on the underside of the movable jaw, that half sphere gives sort of a misalignment allowance, and it'll move and eventually find a flat against the nut. It's a rather ingenious invention, and you can tell that because everybody and their brother has ripped it off and put it into their vices. With the grub screw in place, locking the movable jaw to the nut, I can install the fixed jaw now. First is that key, and then the fixed jaw, and then the socket head cap screws go in from underneath. Both jaws now reinstalled. I can reinstall these two jaw plates. I know that before I took this vise apart, the vise jaw plates weren't perfectly aligned, but they were certainly a lot better than this. I'm thinking maybe for whatever reason, I put the fixed one on the movable jaw and the movable one on the fixed jaw, as if that should matter. But just to see if it makes a difference, I'm going to go ahead and swap them around. That might have made a little bit of difference, and if I had a surface grinder, maybe I'd slap them up there and give them a grind, but I don't, so I'm going to have to make do with what I can and maybe try to shim up this fixed jaw with some razor blades temporarily to see if that might get a little bit closer. Yeah, and it's a little bit better, but not quite what I was hoping for. I'm just going to have to use what I have. I'm not going to put the swivel base back underneath this vise. I really don't think I will ever need it, and if I do, I'll have it sitting on the shelf. And even though this vise isn't anywhere near perfect, I still think the design of it is a little better than this Bridgeport vise that I have on the milling machine now. So this one will come off and it'll go on a shelf. I have the swivel base for it as well. I don't know, maybe I'll sell it, or maybe I'll keep it around just in case. I put my Brown and Sharp best test indicator in the drill chuck and have it up against the fixed jaw to get it all trammed in. I'm using a technique I saw other YouTube machinists use, which is you keep tapping the vise until the dial stops moving. I could probably waste an entire afternoon trying to chase down that last half of a thousandth, but I think what I'm going to do is call good enough good enough. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to explain a little bit about what I go through when I do some of these small restorations. Hope it makes sense. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.